The Supreme Court chamber fell deadly silent as Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett standing at the podium below. What happened next would shock the entire nation and break the internet within hours. Congresswoman Crockett. Justice Sotomayor's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Your arguments today have been nothing short of reckless. Do you truly believe the American people should trust someone who clearly doesn't understand the Constitution she swore to defend? The packed gallery gasped. Legal experts in the front row exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't supposed to happen. Supreme Court justices don't usually grill members of Congress during oral arguments. But Justice Sotomayor wasn't finished. Crockett, standing in her signature bright red blazer, gripped the podium tighter. Her heart pounded as hundreds of eyes bore down on her. The 33-year-old Texas Democrat had walked into the nation's highest court expecting a routine hearing about voting rights. Instead, she found herself in the fight of her political life. Justice Sotomayor. Crockett began, her voice steady despite the ambush. With all due respect, I think you're about to learn something about the Constitution that might surprise you. The chamber erupted in whispers. Chief Justice Roberts banged his gavel for order. Legal Twitter was about to explode. Because what Jasmine Crockett pulled out next would leave Justice Sotomayor speechless and change how America views both women forever. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these jaw-dropping political moments that everyone's talking about. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Supreme Court history. Two brilliant women, both trailblazers in their own right, about to clash in a battle that would define constitutional law and political courage for years to come. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two powerhouse women are, and why this confrontation mattered so much. Justice Sonia Sotomayor sits as the first Latina Supreme Court justice in American history. Appointed by President Obama in 2009, she's known for her sharp intellect, passionate questioning, and fierce defense of civil rights. At 70 years old, she's seen it all during her decades on the bench. Born in the Bronx to Puerto Rican parents, she climbed from housing projects to the highest court in the land. Her colleagues respect her, lawyers fear her tough questions, and conservatives often view her as an activist judge who lets emotion drive her decisions. Sotomayor had built a reputation for not holding back during oral arguments. She interrupts lawyers, challenges their logic, and isn't afraid to show frustration when she thinks someone is wasting the court's time. Legal scholars call her the court's most vocal liberal voice. But today, she was about to meet her match. On the other side stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the 33-year-old rising star from Texas who's been shaking up Washington since arriving in 2023. A former public defender and civil rights attorney, Crockett grew up in St. Louis before moving to Texas for law school. She's known for her quick wit, fearless attitude, and ability to go viral with her sharp political commentary. Crockett had earned national attention for her fierce questioning during congressional hearings, her defense of voting rights, and her willingness to take on anyone, regardless of party or position. Republicans often dismissed her as just another progressive troublemaker. Democrats saw her as the future of the party. But nobody questioned her legal credentials or her ability to think on her feet. The case that brought them together was Texas v.S. Department of Justice, a voting rights dispute that could reshape how America conducts elections. Texas was challenging federal oversight of its voting laws, claiming the Justice Department was overreaching. Crockett had been invited to present arguments supporting federal oversight, a rare honor for a freshman congresswoman. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This case would determine whether states could freely change voting rules without federal approval, potentially affecting millions of Americans' right to vote. Conservative justices seemed inclined to side with Texas. Liberal justices wanted to preserve federal oversight. The swing votes were up for grabs. Crockett knew she was walking into hostile territory. The conservative majority had been rolling back voting rights protections for years. She also knew that Justice Sotomayor, despite being an ally on most issues, had a reputation for grilling lawyers who weren't prepared for her intellectual firepower. What Crockett didn't expect was for Justice Sotomayor to come after her personally, questioning not just her arguments but her very qualifications to stand before the court. The justice had clearly done her homework on the young congresswoman, and she wasn't impressed by what she'd found. The media had been buzzing about this case for weeks. CNN, Fox News, Mississippi, NBC, everyone knew this could be the most important voting rights case in decades. Legal experts packed the gallery. C-SPAN cameras captured every moment. Social media was already lighting up with predictions about how the arguments would go. But nobody predicted the personal confrontation that was about to erupt between these two brilliant, strong-willed women, one representing the established legal order, the other representing a new generation of political leaders unwilling to back down from anyone. The constitutional principles at stake were huge: federalism, voting rights, the balance of power between state and federal government. But this was about to become something much more personal, a clash between experience and youth, establishment and insurgency, judicial restraint and political passion. As Crockett stood at that podium, facing 9 of the most powerful judges in America, she had no idea that Justice Sotomayor was about to launch an attack that would test every skill she'd learned as a lawyer, every instinct she'd developed as a politician, and every ounce of courage she possessed as a black woman standing up for her beliefs. The next few minutes would either destroy her rising political career or launch her into the stratosphere of American politics. There was no middle ground. The trouble started almost immediately after Crockett began her opening statement. She had barely gotten through her first paragraph about federal voting protections when Justice Sotomayor pounced. "Congresswoman, let me stop you right there," Sotomayor interrupted, her voice sharp with irritation. "You're citing the Voting Rights Act like it's some kind of sacred text, but do you actually understand the legal nuances of what you're arguing?" The gallery fell silent. This wasn't normal. Supreme Court justices typically let lawyers present their arguments before jumping in with questions. But Sotomayor seemed determined to throw Crockett off her game from the very beginning. Crockett paused, clearly surprised by the aggressive tone. "Justice Sotomayor, I've spent years studying voting rights law, both as a practicing attorney and as a member of Congress. I believe I understand the issues quite well." "Really?" Sotomayor's eyebrows shot up. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're reciting talking points rather than engaging with the actual constitutional questions before this court." The other justices exchanged glances. Even the conservative members seemed taken aback by Sotomayor's hostile approach. Chief Justice Roberts looked uncomfortable, but didn't intervene. Crockett took a deep breath. She'd faced tough crowds before, hostile judges, angry voters, Republican colleagues trying to intimidate her. But this felt different. This was supposed to be an ally attacking her credibility in front of the entire nation. "Justice Sotomayor, if you'll allow me to continue, I think my arguments will demonstrate a thorough understanding of both the law and the real-world impacts of this court's decisions." But Sotomayor wasn't backing down. "The real-world impacts? Congresswoman, this is the Supreme Court of the United States, not a campaign rally. We deal in legal precedent and constitutional interpretation, not political rhetoric." The insult hit hard. Crockett's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I'm well aware of where I am, Justice Sotomayor. And I'm also aware that the Constitution isn't just an abstract document. It affects real people's lives every single day. Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady." Sotomayor's voice carried a tone that made veteran Supreme Court reporters sit up straighter. "I've been interpreting it longer than you've been practicing law." The young lady comment sent a shockwave through the chamber. Legal experts knew that Sotomayor was known for her tough questioning, but this felt personal. Social media was already exploding with reactions to the live stream. Crockett felt her anger rising but forced herself to stay professional. "Justice Sotomayor, I've come here today with specific legal arguments supported by precedent and evidence. If you'd like to hear them, I'm ready to present them. If you'd prefer to question my qualifications, we can do that too. But I don't think that's what the American people expect from this court." That response drew murmurs from the gallery. Crockett had just called out a Supreme Court justice for improper behavior, something that simply wasn't done. Justice Thomas actually cracked a slight smile. Justice Kavanaugh looked shocked. Sotomayor's eyes flashed with anger. "The American people expect this court to ensure that only qualified individuals present arguments that will shape constitutional law for generations. Your resume, Congresswoman, while impressive in some ways, doesn't inspire confidence that you understand the gravity of what you're asking us to decide." The attack was getting more personal by the minute. Sotomayor continued, "You've been in Congress for less than 2 years. Before that, you were a public defender, admirable work, but hardly Supreme Court level. You've never argued a case before any appellate court, let alone this one. So tell me, what exactly qualifies you to stand in that spot and ask 9 justices to reshape American election law?" The chamber was dead silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Supreme Court justices simply didn't attack the qualifications of lawyers appearing before them like this, especially not allied lawyers in cases they presumably supported. Crockett stood perfectly still for a moment, processing the full scope of the attack. This wasn't just about her legal arguments anymore. Justice Sotomayor was questioning her right to even be there, dismissing her experience, and doing it in front of a national audience. But something in Crockett's eyes shifted. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the cold anger she'd learned to channel during her years fighting for justice in Texas courtrooms. She'd faced down hostile judges before, prosecutors who tried to intimidate her, and defense attorneys who thought they could push around a young black woman lawyer. Justice Sotomayor, Crockett began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that everyone in the chamber could hear. You're absolutely right that I've never argued before this court. But you know what I have done? I've spent years in courtrooms fighting for people whose constitutional rights were being violated. I've seen firsthand what happens when voting rights are stripped away. I've represented clients who were denied their fundamental rights because of laws exactly like the ones Texas is trying to defend today. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. And yes, I've only been in Congress for less than 2 years. But in that time, I've authored legislation, conducted oversight hearings, and worked directly on the issues this case addresses. So while I may not have your decades of experience on the bench, I do have something else. Direct, recent experience with how these laws actually affect real people's lives. The tension in the room was electric. Justice Sotomayor's face had grown stern, clearly not expecting this level of pushback from someone she'd apparently decided to intimidate. Furthermore, Crockett continued, gaining confidence with each word, I find it interesting that you're questioning my qualifications when this court regularly hears arguments from lawyers with far less experience than I have. The only difference seems to be that they're not young black women from Texas who dare to challenge the status quo. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Several reporters frantically typed on their phones. Crockett had just accused a sitting Supreme Court justice of bias, something that could end her career or launch her into the political stratosphere. Justice Sotomayor's face flushed red. Congresswoman Crockett, I find your insinuation both inappropriate and offensive. My questions are based solely on your legal qualifications, not your race or gender. Are they? Crockett shot back, her voice rising slightly. Because I've watched dozens of Supreme Court arguments, Justice Sotomayor, I've never seen you grill a lawyer about their basic qualifications before they even get to present their case. So either you're having an off day, or something about me specifically has triggered this unusual line of questioning. The chamber erupted in whispers. Chief Justice Roberts looked like he wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how. The other justices sat in stunned silence, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had clearly decided that if Justice Sotomayor wanted a fight, she was going to get one. And since we're discussing qualifications, Justice Sotomayor, let me remind you of something. I was elected by the people of Texas's 30th District to represent their interests. I didn't ask to be here today. I was invited by this court to present arguments on behalf of millions of Americans whose voting rights are at stake. So while you may question whether I belong here, the voters who sent me to Congress apparently disagree. That line hit like a thunderbolt. Crockett had just reminded Justice Sotomayor that as an unelected judge, she didn't have the same democratic mandate that Crockett possessed as an elected representative. Justice Sotomayor's eyes blazed with fury. Congresswoman, your electoral mandate doesn't grant you expertise in constitutional law or appellate advocacy. This court operates on legal precedent and reasoned analysis, not popular opinion. You're absolutely right, Crockett replied, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone who realized she was winning this exchange. This court should operate on legal precedent and reasoned analysis. So perhaps we should focus on the actual legal arguments I came here to present, rather than conducting a job interview that honestly feels more like a hazing ritual. The gallery couldn't contain itself anymore. Low murmurs and whispers filled the chamber as spectators tried to process what they were witnessing. Legal reporters were already crafting headlines in their minds. Justice Sotomayor clashes with Congresswoman. Supreme Court showdown goes viral. Crockett stands up to Justice Sotomayor. But the confrontation was far from over. Justice Sotomayor had clearly underestimated the young Congresswoman, and she wasn't about to back down gracefully. The next phase of this battle would determine which woman emerged victorious, and which one would face the consequences of this very public clash. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and analyzed by legal experts for years to come. Justice Sotomayor, clearly rattled by Crockett's unexpected pushback, decided to escalate the confrontation even further. Very well, Congresswoman. Sotomayor said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Since you're so confident in your legal expertise, let me test it. Can you cite the specific section of the Constitution that grants Congress the authority to override state election laws? It was a trap question, designed to make Crockett look foolish. Constitutional scholars knew there wasn't a single, specific section. The authority came from multiple constitutional provisions working together. Most lawyers would stumble over this kind of gotcha question. But Crockett smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a defensive smile, a confident smile that sent a chill through the chamber because it suggested she knew something Justice Sotomayor didn't. Justice Sotomayor, I think you're asking the wrong question, Crockett replied calmly. The real question isn't which specific section grants Congress that authority. It's why you seem to have forgotten that multiple sections of the Constitution work together to protect voting rights. The W.com, Justice's eyes narrowed. Enlighten me, Congresswoman. Gladly. Crockett moved slightly away from the podium, her confidence growing with each word. The 15th Amendment prohibits denial of voting rights based on race. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause prevents discriminatory voting practices. The Elections Clause in Article 1, Section 4, gives Congress explicit power to regulate federal elections. And the Necessary and Proper Clause provides the mechanism for enforcement. She paused, letting that sink in before delivering her first major blow. But here's what's really interesting. Justice Sotomayor, in your 2013 dissent in Shelby County v. Holder, you know, the case that gutted the Voting Rights Act, you wrote, and I quote, "The Constitution grants Congress the authority to enforce the promises of the 15th Amendment through appropriate legislation." The chamber fell dead silent. Crockett had just quoted Justice Sotomayor's own words back to her, demonstrating not only that she knew the law but that she had studied Sotomayor's own judicial opinions. So either you've changed your mind about congressional authority over voting rights, Crockett continued, or you're testing me for reasons that have nothing to do with the legal issues before this court today. Justice Sotomayor's face had gone pale. She had been caught using her own precedent against her, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The other justices sat in stunned silence, watching one of their colleagues get systematically dismantled by a freshman congresswoman. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had clearly come prepared for this possibility. In fact, Justice Sotomayor, since we're discussing constitutional authority, let me share something else you might find interesting. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a document. This is a copy of your confirmation hearing testimony from 2009. Would you like me to read what you said about the importance of considering real-world impacts when interpreting constitutional law? The trap was now completely reversed. Sotomayor had tried to embarrass Crockett by demanding constitutional citations and dismissing real-world considerations. Now Crockett was about to use Sotomayor's own confirmation testimony to prove that the justice was contradicting her own judicial philosophy. Congresswoman, Chief Justice Roberts finally intervened. Perhaps we should move to your prepared arguments. But Crockett held up a respectful hand. With permission, Chief Justice Roberts, I think Justice Sotomayor deserves an answer to her question about my qualifications, since she's made it such a central part of today's proceedings. Roberts nodded reluctantly, clearly realizing that trying to stop this confrontation now would only make it more explosive. Crockett turned back to Justice Sotomayor, her voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had found her footing. You questioned whether my experience as a public defender qualifies me to stand before this court. Let me tell you what that experience taught me, Justice Sotomayor. I learned that constitutional rights aren't abstract concepts. They're the difference between freedom and imprisonment, between justice and oppression, between having a voice and being silenced. She stepped closer to the bench, her voice gaining strength. I represented a 19-year-old black man who was denied his right to vote because he couldn't afford the fees required to get the ID Texas demanded. I represented a 67-year-old Latina grandmother who was removed from voter rolls because she moved apartments within the same district. I represented a 34-year-old veteran who was told his military ID wasn't sufficient to vote in the state he had served. The chamber was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So when you ask what qualifies me to stand here, Justice Sotomayor, I'll tell you. I've seen the human faces behind every legal principle we're discussing today. I've held the hands of people whose constitutional rights were violated by laws exactly like the ones Texas is defending. And I've won cases, lots of them, protecting those rights. She paused, then delivered the knockout punch. The question isn't whether I'm qualified to be here, Justice Sotomayor. The question is whether this court is still interested in protecting the constitutional rights of people like my former clients, or whether it's more concerned with abstract legal theories that ignore the real-world consequences of your decisions. The chamber erupted, not in whispers this time, but in actual gasps and exclamations. Crockett had just accused the Supreme Court of being out of touch with the people their decisions affected, and she had done it while standing directly in front of them. Justice Sotomayor's mouth fell open. She had clearly never experienced anything like this in her years on the bench. The other justices looked shocked, impressed, and terrified all at the same time. But Crockett still wasn't finished. She had one more card to play. And since we're discussing my qualifications, let me share one more thing. Justice Sotomayor, you've written extensively about the importance of diversity on the bench, about how different backgrounds and experiences strengthen judicial decision-making. You've argued that a wise Latina woman might reach better conclusions than others because of her unique perspective. Crockett's voice grew stronger with each word. Well, I'm a wise young black woman from Texas, and my perspective, shaped by years of fighting for voting rights in courtrooms across my state, tells me that the legal arguments I came here to present are not only constitutionally sound but morally necessary. So either diversity of perspective matters or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways. The trap was complete. Crockett had used Justice Sotomayor's own famous wise Latina comment against her, suggesting that if Sotomayor believed diverse perspectives strengthened decision-making, she should welcome Crockett's perspective rather than attack her qualifications. Justice Sotomayor sat in stunned silence. Around her, the other justices tried to process what they had just witnessed. Chief Justice Roberts looked like he was calculating whether to call a recess or let this unprecedented confrontation continue. But the damage was done. In less than 10 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had taken Justice Sotomayor's aggressive attack and turned it into a masterclass in legal argumentation, constitutional law, and political courage. She had quoted the justice's own opinions back to her, cited her confirmation testimony, and used her famous comments about diversity to support her own standing. Most importantly, she had shifted the entire narrative. Instead of looking like an unqualified young politician out of her depth, Crockett now appeared to be a brilliant legal mind who had outmaneuvered one of the most respected justices on the court. The gallery was electric with tension and excitement. Social media was exploding with clips and reactions. Legal experts were frantically rewriting their analyses. This wasn't just a Supreme Court argument anymore. It was a cultural moment, a generational clash, and a perfect example of how a well-prepared underdog could triumph over institutional power. Justice Sotomayor finally found her voice. Congresswoman Crockett, she said quietly, I believe we should move to your prepared arguments. Crockett nodded graciously. Thank you, Justice Sotomayor. I look forward to presenting them. But everyone in that chamber knew the real argument was already over. Jasmine Crockett had won, and the whole world was about to find out. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished her formal arguments and left the Supreme Court building, the political and legal world exploded into chaos. What had started as a routine voting rights case had become the most watched Supreme Court confrontation in decades, and the aftershocks were felt across every level of American politics. Within minutes of the argument's ending, #Crockett Destroys Justice was trending #1 on Twitter worldwide. The hashtag #WiseYoungBlackWoman quickly followed, referencing Crockett's brilliant use of Justice Sotomayor's own wise Latina comments against her. TikTok videos breaking down the confrontation were already accumulating millions of views. Legal Twitter was in complete meltdown. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School tweeted, In 40 years of watching Supreme Court arguments, I've never seen anything like what Jasmine Crockett just did. She didn't just defend herself. She gave a masterclass in constitutional law while standing her ground against a sitting justice. Conservative legal scholar Josh Blackman wrote, I disagree with Crockett's politics, but what she did today was remarkable. She out-argued a Supreme Court justice using the justice's own words and precedents. That takes serious legal skill and incredible nerve. But the most explosive reaction came from an unexpected source, retired Justice Anthony Kennedy, who almost never comments on current cases. In a rare statement to CNN, Kennedy said, What we witnessed today raises serious questions about the appropriate boundaries of judicial questioning. Congresswoman Crockett showed remarkable composure and legal acumen under what appeared to be an inappropriate attack on her credentials. The criticism of Justice Sotomayor's behavior was swift and bipartisan. Liberal legal scholar Erwin Chemerinsky called it beneath the dignity of the court. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, rarely one to defend progressive politicians, tweeted, Sotomayor got destroyed because she chose personal attack over legal argument. Crockett played it perfectly. But it was the reaction from ordinary Americans that truly showed the cultural impact of what had happened. Videos of Crockett's responses were being shared millions of times with comments like, "This is what standing up for yourself looks like. She just showed every young woman how to handle a bully," and, "Finally, someone who fights back instead of just taking it." The political implications were immediate and massive. Within hours of the confrontation, Crockett's congressional office was flooded with interview requests from every major news outlet. Democratic leaders who had previously seen her as a promising but junior member suddenly realized they had a superstar on their hands. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries issued a statement. Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated today why fresh voices and diverse perspectives strengthen our democracy. Her brilliant defense of voting rights and her composed response to aggressive questioning showed the legal expertise and personal courage that make her an invaluable member of our caucus. But it was the response from the 240. Congressional Black Caucus that really showed how dramatically Crockett's standing had changed. CBC Chair Stephen Horsford announced that Crockett would be named to the caucus's leadership team, effective immediately. Today, Jasmine Crockett showed the nation what we've known all along. She's one of the brightest legal minds in Congress and a fearless advocate for civil rights. Republican reactions were more complicated. While many conservative legal experts praised Crockett's legal arguments, Republican politicians struggled with how to respond to someone who had just become a Democratic hero overnight. Senator Ted Cruz, never one to miss a political opportunity, tried to attack Crockett on Twitter. Disrespecting a Supreme Court justice isn't legal brilliance, it's arrogance. But the response backfired spectacularly when thousands of users replied with videos of Cruz's own confrontational behavior in congressional hearings. Meanwhile, progressive groups were treating Crockett like a conquering hero. The NAACP announced they were giving her their highest honor for defending voting rights. Move On started a fundraising campaign for her future campaigns that raised over $500,000 in the first 24 hours. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how the confrontation changed the national conversation about the Supreme Court itself. For years, justices had been treated as untouchable figures whose behavior was beyond criticism. Crockett's willingness to call out Justice Sotomayor's inappropriate questioning had opened a new front in debates about judicial accountability. Legal ethics experts began examining whether Justice Sotomayor's behavior violated judicial conduct standards. Professor Stephen Gillers of NYU Law School told The Washington Post, "Justices are supposed to question legal arguments, not attack the personal qualifications of lawyers appearing before them. What we saw today crossed that line." The controversy also reignited debates about diversity and representation in legal settings. Crockett's point about being questioned more aggressively than other lawyers resonated with women and minorities who had experienced similar treatment in professional settings. Dr. Paulette Brown, former president of the American Bar Association, wrote in an op-ed, "What happened to Congresswoman Crockett happens to young lawyers of color every day in courtrooms across America. The difference is that it usually happens without cameras, without witnesses, and without the platform to fight back effectively." Within a week, law schools across the country were using video of the confrontation in their classes on oral advocacy and professional conduct. Students were studying Crockett's responses as examples of how to handle hostile questioning while maintaining professionalism and making substantive legal points. The impact on Crockett's own career was immediate and transformative. She went from being a relatively unknown freshman congresswoman to one of the most recognized political figures in America literally overnight. Speaking requests flooded in from universities, bar associations, and political organizations across the country. More importantly for her legislative goals, the confrontation had dramatically raised the profile of voting rights issues. The case she had come to argue was now front-page news everywhere, and her arguments about the real-world impact of voting restrictions were reaching millions of people who had never paid attention to Supreme Court cases before. But Crockett was smart enough to know that viral moments fade, and she moved quickly to capitalize on her newfound platform. Within days, she had introduced new legislation strengthening voting protections, organized a series of town halls on constitutional rights, and announced a legal defense fund for people whose voting rights had been violated. The response to Justice Sotomayor was more complicated. While legal experts criticized her aggressive questioning, many progressives were reluctant to attack a groundbreaking Latina justice too harshly. Sotomayor herself remained silent for several days before issuing a carefully worded statement. "I have always believed that vigorous questioning strengthens legal arguments and ensures that all perspectives are thoroughly examined," she wrote. Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated impressive legal knowledge and advocacy skills in her responses to my questions. I look forward to reading her written submissions in this important case." It was a gracious statement that didn't quite apologize but acknowledged Crockett's performance. Legal insiders interpreted it as Sotomayor's way of ending the controversy without admitting wrongdoing. But the cultural impact of the confrontation extended far beyond law and politics. Young women across America, especially women of color, saw in Crockett's performance a model for how to respond to institutional intimidation. Social media was filled with stories from women who said Crockett's example had inspired them to speak up in their own professional and educational settings. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, wrote, "Jasmine Crockett's performance today reminded us that young black women have always been at the forefront of fighting for justice, even when, especially when, they're told they don't belong in the room." The long-term implications for American politics were still being calculated, but several trends were already clear. Crockett had shown that viral moments could be converted into real political power when handled skillfully. Her fundraising numbers skyrocketed, her poll numbers in Texas jumped dramatically, and political observers began speculating about her potential for higher office. More broadly, the confrontation had demonstrated that traditional institutional authority was increasingly vulnerable to challenge by well-prepared, media-savvy younger politicians who weren't intimidated by titles or settings. As the weeks passed, the Supreme Court case that had started the whole controversy faded from headlines. But the lessons of Jasmine Crockett's showdown with Justice Sotomayor continued to reverberate. She had shown that courage, preparation, and quick thinking could triumph over institutional power, that diverse voices could strengthen democratic discourse, and that sometimes the most powerful response to an attack is to stand your ground and fight back with facts, logic, and unshakable confidence. 6 months later, when Time magazine named Crockett one of their rising stars of American politics, they wrote, "In 10 minutes at the Supreme Court, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She redefined what it means to stand up for your principles in the face of institutional pressure." The confrontation had made both women more famous, but only one of them had emerged with her reputation enhanced. Justice Sotomayor remained a respected jurist, but the incident had tarnished her image as a champion of diversity and inclusion. Crockett, meanwhile, had gone from rising star to political phenomenon, proving that sometimes the best defense truly is a good offense. The story of their clash would be studied in law schools, celebrated in political circles, and remembered as the moment when a young black woman from Texas showed the entire nation that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, was beyond accountability when they stepped out of line. And as Crockett continued to rise in American politics, using her newfound platform to fight for voting rights, economic justice, and constitutional principles, people would remember the day she stood in the nation's highest court and proved that courage, preparation, and principle could triumph over intimidation, privilege, and institutional power. Thanks for watching this incredible showdown between two brilliant women who reminded us that our democracy is strongest when people are willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in. If you want to see more stories like this about political courage and unexpected confrontations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments that define American politics. What did you think of Crockett's performance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.